Welcome to UCF in Print. I'm Alice Collier. Black Seminole Indians living in Florida seems believable, but Black Seminoles living in the Bahamas may seem a little far-fetched. In fact, who would think there's a whole community of people who are commonly referred to as the Red Bays? UCF Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Director of North American Indian Studies Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Dr. Rosalyn Howard introduces us to this rare society. Her book is titled Black Seminoles in the Bahamas. Welcome, Rosalyn.
Thank you.
You know, I was doing a little research on my own about Black Seminoles living in the Bahamas, and there is nothing out there except your book.
Yes, it's wonderful to have my own little niche in this, and also to publicize this unknown story about a group of people who migrated there.
Well, I'm going to ask you all about you know, why there is not more written about them. But let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about how they got here to Florida and then to the Bahamas.
Okay, as you know, most people think about the Underground Railroad as only heading north.
Yeah.
But Florida was the southern route of the Underground Railroad, and that was mainly because of an invitation from the governor of Florida, who was Spanish at that time. And he said that anyone who escaped into Florida would gain their freedom provided they adopt Catholicism. And so that was a way that they knew they could find freedom. But once here, some of them also joined with the Seminole Indians, who were had a very benevolent kind of slavery system, if you would. They were technically considered slaves, but they were really more like tenant farmers, or it was a system more like peonage, where they would pay the Seminole chief a portion of their harvest from their farms, and they were pretty much allowed to live in freedom.
Now, let me take you back there for a second. The runaway slaves, those who escaped bondage, would come to Florida, and I assume then in those days, we're talking the 1800s.
Yes.
It was rough terrain here.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't like it is now.
No, definitely not. There were no roads paved out or
before Disney.
Exactly.
But,
yes.
So it was natural then for people to go with, you know, other populations of people?
Well, in a way, it was natural because they were embattled. They were all embattled people. The Americans were trying to take over Florida from the Spanish, which is why they wanted more people. They wanted them to fight along their side to prevent the Americans from taking over Florida. The Seminoles, likewise, wanted to prevent the Americans from taking their land here in Florida, and so adding numbers to their population was very helpful in many ways. In addition, the Black Seminoles, who were Africans, actually, who became known as Black Seminoles because of their association with the Seminoles, not always intermarrying or interbreeding, if you will.
Okay.
So some of them really had no Indian blood per se.
But they adopted the culture?
To a degree, yes. They adopted some of the dress and housing construction because they had to constantly be on the move. Their houses were of thatch and poles that could be easily built and in new places when they were chased off by slave catchers or Americans who were pushing the Seminoles further and further south.
True survivors.
Yes, indeed.
I don't think we can overemphasize the fact that this was rough. This was rough living.
Yes, indeed, it was. And the Africans who had some special skills from their experiences in Africa, planting rice, and they were more used to this type of terrain than some of the Seminoles were, because the Seminoles were actually an aggregate of various ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
A majority of them, however, were from the Creeks, from Georgia and Alabama. And so this terrain in Florida and this climate was very different from what they were used to. And so the African skills were very helpful to the Seminoles.
So the Seminoles, like you said, still had some sort of slavery system.
Yes. And some of them had really more like the chattel slavery system, but most did allow the blacks to live actually in separate communities, which were adjacent to the Seminole villages.
So then was that motivation for other people to continue to want to leave then Florida?
Well, what happened is once Florida became part of the United States, it was annexed in 1819, things got increasingly worse for the Seminoles and for the Africans or Black Seminoles who lived with them. And at first they went to Cuba, they went to the Bahamas because they had relationships with the British in the Bahamas, they had relationships with the Spanish in Cuba, asking for help, seeking help again to help them fight against the Americans. But unfortunately, they were turned down several times in Nassau. And that's the route that I've been following. At some later date, I hope to follow the path of the Black Seminoles into Cuba. But
now, Rosalyn, how did they get there? I mean, obviously by boat, but did they build their own boats, or did they?
Yes. The Seminoles were noted for being able to build large canoes with sails. They had established a trade relationship with the British in the Bahamas for a long period of time, and so that's another. They had befriended the British in Florida and actually fought in battles with them against the Americans, and also the relationship in the Bahamas, and so that's why they figured that these people were going to help them.
And so that's what happened with this migration.
Yes.
So they get to Nassau, and then what?
They get to Nassau on a couple of occasions, and the British there said, no, we've just signed a peace treaty with the United States and we can't help you. This was in 1819.
About how many people are we talking about?
Well, that first voyage was just Chief Kanaji and a small party, including a man named Abraham, who was a Black Seminole interpreter who had even gone to Washington, D.C. to negotiate treaties.
Oh, my.
Because he spoke several languages, including the Seminole Miccosukee or Muskogee languages, as well as English and Spanish. But they went there as a small party and were turned back. A couple of years later, in 1821, they figured out that they weren't going to get any help in Nassau, and so they decided to land on Andros Island instead. And Andros was a very sparsely populated island, and they chose a remote corner of it, the northwestern tip, where no one was, and they figured they could kind of, establish their own community there, and the slave catchers wouldn't be able to get them.
And they did?
And they did establish the community there called Red Bays.
Okay, and hence the name that they call themselves the Red Bays.
Well, actually, they don't call themselves the Red Bays. I refer to them as Red Bayans in the book because they live there, but they call themselves Bahamians. They cherish this Black Seminole heritage very much, but they are also, after 200 years, they have totally acculturated to Bahamian
How
culture.
many people now live in this community?
There are approximately between 280 and 300 people. It varies a lot because the composition of the households change a lot with various kin coming in to visit, lots of babies being born, and people moving back and forth, especially between that community and Nassau for work.
Now, how come we haven't heard more about them? How come they're not listed or mentioned in history books?
Well, unfortunately, the history books really deal a lot with the majority culture, and also have really obscured a lot of the history of interactions between subjugated groups, such as these Native Americans and Africans who were both enslaved at certain points. And it's really an omission that I believe is in some ways based upon racist ideas about who is important enough to include in history books. But they were mentioned several times in various books, but no one had ever really explored the group who went east to the Bahamas. There are many books about the Seminoles in Florida and their trek to what was called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Most of those books, if they mention it at all, they just have a few sentences that say, oh, some of them went to the Bahamas.
That's
and
not sufficient history, though.
Right, right.
So how did you get interested in this? How did you hear about them?
Well, I heard about them from a professor of mine at University of Florida, Dr. John Moore, who, when he found out about my heritage of African and Native American, he asked me, had I ever heard of these Black Seminoles, and told me that there was an archaeologist, an archaeology professor from University of Florida, who in the 1930s had done research on Andros Island and discovered these people who said they were part Seminole and whose families had come from the Bahamas. And I said, oh no, I've never heard of that. And I wanted to do some research that hadn't been done before, and to add to the historical and anthropological records. Yes, and I'm very happy to do that. Not only for myself, my own benefit, but to really bring light to a rich oral tradition that was still existing in this particular community, where there are a large number of people who are descended from the original group who left between 1821 and 1840s or so.
Okay, so how did you get to know them?
I got to
You
know.
moved in.
Yes, I moved in, but unlike some anthropologists do, I didn't just swoop
Go
in
for a
on the
little while, huh?
community,
Okay,
right?
okay.
I went and asked permission. I spoke with one of the leaders, or one of the main leaders in the community. His name is Reverend Newton, and he had written a small pamphlet in 1968 that that explored the oral history of that community. And I went and asked him, would it be all right for me to come and study this community and write down your oral histories? And he said, yes, we would love for you to do that. And so a few months later, I did come, and I lived in the community for a year.
Well, now tell me about it. Tell me what you found out about this community.
Or what was it like when I first moved in?
What you thought before and then after?
Well, this was my first field work. Okay. And even though you read books about what it's like doing field work, you never really know until you get there.
Yeah.
And I was a non-traditional age student to begin with. I'd started this career after a whole other career. And I went there, and the first home I lived in was with a woman and her 5 children. And there were 2 bedrooms. There was her bedroom with a double bed, and another bedroom with 2
And I bet you didn't have
bunk
children.
beds.
Did you have children at the time?
I had one son, but he was grown by then. He didn't come with me.
You forgot what it was like, and certainly not living with 5.
Right, and the home had no electricity.
Okay.
And it had running water, but it was all cold. There was no hot water. And I was sitting in this bedroom, dark, that I arrived in the evening, and it quickly got dark. Mosquitoes started biting at me. There was no electricity, so there was no fan. And then I heard a noise in the ceiling, and I said, what is that? There were mice running all in the ceiling.
That would have been the end of my field work.
It was almost the end of mine, but I sat on the edge of the bed and I said, well, these people have survived this.
Yeah.
I think I can do this too. And after all, I'm supposed to be an anthropologist, right? So I managed to get through the first culture shock, yes. But then later I lived with another woman who actually had an extra bedroom, because the first home was I was really putting her out of her bedroom, and I felt bad about that. So I moved into another home, and which had running water and hot water and electricity. So I had moved up in the world. It still had mice occasionally, but I mean, it's a very rural area, and so that kind of thing is just something that happens.
Tell me about the Reverend, for example.
Reverend Newton is a wonderful man. He was the only teacher in the primary school that they have in that community for over 40 years. He's the
only teacher.
The only teacher, yes.
That they have in an elementary school.
They had what was originally called an all-age school that went to the 4th grade. After that, there was no more schooling unless a person had a relative outside of the community in another settlement that was closer to the high school. But later changed to Red Bay's primary school, and it now goes to the 6th grade. Well, Reverend Newton told me wonderful stories about what it was like to teach at that time. And he said they taught in a building that was originally the church. So they had church and school in the same building. Well, a hurricane came and blew the building down. And so for several years, he had to teach school outside, and he put his blackboard up in the tree, he said.
Oh, my.
And taught the students that way. But in the 1960s, which is the reason he wrote his pamphlet at that time, was that it was a time of great change for this community. A logging company was cutting a road for the first time into this community. Before then, the only way to reach Red Bays was by boat or by walking about 3 miles through dense bush, as they call it, the pine yard and the thatch plants. So he knew that that was going to bring a lot of change to the community, and that's why he wanted to write down what it was like before all of that happened. So the road wasn't paved, though, until the late 1980s.
Oh, my.
So it was still very difficult to get in and out of there because of how roads get rutted, you know, in that kind of climate. The limestone soil gets, it's very difficult to traverse. But
so what's the story of his ancestry? What does he tell you?
He is
Because this is storytelling.
Yes,
right?
He is directly related to one of the original settlers named Moses Newton, who came from Florida in a canoe, as they all like to say, in a dugout canoe. And he actually, his great-grandfather, stopped at Red Bays for a while, but then went to a different community called Stanyard Creek. And there were some of the Black Seminoles who didn't all stay in Red Bays. They migrated to several other communities, including Nicholstown, Mastic Point, Fresh Creek, where they settled, but they were all still very much intertwined. Their lives were still intertwined because many of the people who settled in those other communities eventually came back to Red Bays to find a wife or a husband. And so those families still remained very close.
So also there were some chiefs that came?
Actually, there are no stories about any chiefs who came.
These were individuals.
These were individuals, but there was one in particular named Scipio Bowlges, who was called a medicine doctor, and he was very, very good with all kinds of herbal medicine, and he passed that tradition down to his granddaughter, Amelia Marshall, who still lives in Red Bays. She's a fascinating story. She is.
How so?
She is the, as I mentioned, the bush medicine woman. She was a midwife, and she says she birthed about 80 babies.
Oh, my.
And she also was the originator of some very beautiful baskets that they make in this community. And these baskets are unlike any others in the Bahamas. It's a very unique style of basket that are made from the thatch plants. And they go out, they cut the thatch, they hang it on clotheslines to dry, and they strip it, and then they sew it into these wonderful baskets.
I'm fascinated. You said these stories come down over generations,
Yes.
they're told. How do you know, as an anthropologist, that they're telling you fact or fiction?
Well, oftentimes we don't know. We take the oral traditions of people, and we understand that over the years, yes, some of these stories may have become embellished. But I was very fortunate to discover some documents in the Bahamas National Archives that really had been placed in a research booklet by an archivist there, David Wood. The letter has the list of 97 names of people who were from this original Red Bays community. The British at that, and this was in 1828, this letter was dated, and it said that they had discovered these people who were living in this community, existing on fish from the sea, from their own gardens and farming. But the British thought mistakenly that these people had been dropped off there by the Spanish, who were continuing the slave trade after the British had abolished it. The British were at that time in the habit of rescuing Africans
And it
from
was their
these ships.
territory. This was
Yes,
British
this
territory.
was British
Okay.
territory. And some of the names on this list match up with the names of these ancestors that were given to me in the oral histories.
I bet you felt like you found gold when you...
I certainly did. It was wonderful. And it helped me to make what we call kinship charts in anthropology.
What's that?
Kinship charts
It's like a family tree?
It's a family tree,
Okay.
exactly. And I was able to trace 5 generations of these Black Seminole descendants, originating with the names on that list.
So tell me some of the wildest stories that you heard.
Some of the wildest
But
stories.
you can't tell me.
Well, I can't tell you some of the wildest, but including some I was involved in.
We'll have to read the book.
Right. But one of the really fascinating things about this community is their belief in spirits, and they have many stories about these creatures who inhabit the pine yards. It's surrounded by these
Which is that
thick
3
pine
mile
yards.
Jungle dense bush you talked about?
Very
Okay.
dense pine yards that they call coppets, which is really Bahamian vernacular for the word coppice, which is a densely wooded area. But they were actually 12 miles away from the main road, and until that main road got built, they were very isolated. But they have wonderful stories about a headless horse that roams in the pine yards, and a couple of folk tales that are specific to this area of Andros, and they have these animals that have red eyes, the body is like a bird, and the feet are like a man, and it's called a chickcharney. And you can't make the chickcharney angry.
And you didn't see any of these.
Oh no,
Okay.
I didn't go far enough back in the bush to find out if it was true or not, because they had frightened me enough.
The mice were enough.
Right. And then there were the Yerhus, which was another half man and half animal type of creature that lurked in the pine yards also. Another story about how dense the pine yards are. One man walked in and he got lost all day.
Oh, yeah.
And so they called that area Lost Man Coppet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I want you to read, if you could, a passage from your book.
Certainly. I'd like to start
Using their language.
Okay. I'd like to start with a quote from Reverend Newton,
Okay,
who is
sure.
very, very important in this community. And I mentioned he was a teacher, but he's also the pastor of the only church in the community.
Oh.
So he's a very important figure there. And when asked about why was this important to him to tell these stories, he says, "Well, to me, it is a gift. When I think back on those my ancestors who had the courage to leave Florida and come here, as I've been told, and settle in Red Bays, and went unnoticed for so long. These were very brave people to have crossed the Gulf Stream and come over here in Andros to settle. I think that it is a rich history. When I think back on the history of Red Bays, I believe that I'm a millionaire." And the majority of my work there, my official work there, was to record the oral history. And I did that by video and audio. And I primarily interviewed the elders, and one of those was named Reverend Benjamin Lewis, who unfortunately passed away earlier this month from an illness, a long illness. But Reverend Newton's father, Joseph Lewis, is the source of the information in Reverend Newton's pamphlet that he published in 1968. And Benjamin Lewis said, "He, my father, let me know that I am a part of the Seminole Indians. My great-grandfather was Sammy Lewis, which was his grandfather. He came from Florida in a canoe, and the first place they rested was at Cedar Coppet. Later on down, they moved from Cedar Coppet, and they went up into a lake, and they came into a little island, and he fall in love with the little island, and he give it name Sammy Lewis after him. He stood there for a while, and after he thought it is fit that he travel someplace else. He start traveling on down north until he reach a place here which we call Red Bay. And he was here until an hurricane came, and this hurricane overflowed the place. And they leave from there, and they came up here to the place called Lewis Coppet. This place was a huge coppet, and one day my grandfather, Watkin Lewis, this was Sammy Lewis's son, He went through this carpet and he began to search through it and went to come back out, and he got lost and been in there almost a whole day. They used to call it Lost Man Carpet, after which he purchased 61 3/4 acre ground and give it name Lewis Carpet. But this place is now known as Red Bay. We, the people of Red Bay, we give God the glory for the old patriarch Sammy Lewis, who had made preparation for this coming generation. And that is why we, the Lewis's people, is called the Seminole descent.
Well, Rosalyn, I'm afraid we are out of time. I could listen to this for a long time. And certainly what your book inspires me to do is go back and talk to my family about some of our histories. Even like you said, even if they get embellished, they're still part of our history.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
a part of our program today. And again, the book is Black Seminoles in the Bahamas. That's our program for now. Thanks for watching UCF in Print. I'm Alice Collier. Until next time, goodbye.